The first time anyone noticed the rain behaving strangely in Harrow's Cove, it was Jacob Renshaw, the town's grizzled lighthouse keeper. Jacob had lived in the lighthouse on the edge of the rocky cliffs for 30 years, weathering countless storms and gales. But this one particular night was different. He swore that what he had seen was true. "I was out on the rocks," Jacob told the sceptical crowd at the Harrow's Rest Tavern. "The rain was coming down like usual, but then it started to—" He paused, and his fingers twisted the brim of his damp hat before he continued. "It started to follow me." Some in the tavern erupted into laughter and dismissive murmurs, but those who had lived in Harrow's Cove long enough knew better than to ignore the lighthouse keeper's words. Jacob was a serious, trustworthy man. If he said he had seen something, as unlikely as it was, then he had probably seen it. By the next week, others had begun to whisper about the rain. Clara, the postmaster's daughter, claimed she saw puddles forming strange patterns on the cobblestones outside her window. Tom Mercer, a fisherman, swore he saw the rain swirling into something that looked almost human before it slid back into the sea. Then, one night, James Whitlock disappeared. James was a carpenter known for his broad shoulders and booming laugh. He had been walking home from the tavern when the rain began to fall. The next morning his wife found the door to their cottage wide open, but no sign of James. All that remained were odd, almost geometric patterns in the water and sand outside their home. Patterns that looked somewhat like footprints, but weren't. The townsfolk searched the cove, the cliffs, and even the forest beyond the town, but James was gone. And so began a slow, creeping unease that settled over Harrow's Cove. Soon things really changed. Now, when the rain came, it didn't behave like rain anymore. It didn't fall in sheets or scatter into chaotic splashes. Instead, it moved deliberately, as though it had a purpose. People began to notice it on their walks home, the droplets collecting together and trailing them like silent hunters. Umbrellas did nothing to stop it. The rain would find a way. Those who tried to outrun it swore they could feel it gaining on them, the cold sting of its touch just behind their necks. At first, people dismissed it as paranoia. But when Esther Grady vanished while carrying groceries back from the shop, her rain-soaked bag left abandoned in the street, no one could deny that something unnatural was happening. There was an old story that my grandmother would tell about what she called rainwalkers, Mrs. Marlowe muttered from her usual perch on the tavern's corner stool. "I heard the stories when I was a young girl. The rain that comes alive, that hunts." The younger patrons rolled their eyes, but others leaned in closer. Mrs. Marlowe's stories were always grim, but there was an unsettling familiarity in her words now. "They're not spirits," she said, her voice low. "They're something old, something ancient. The sea brings them with the storms, and when they do come, it is because they are looking for people to take back with them." No one wanted to believe her, but as more people disappeared, her tale became harder to ignore. By the third week, the town was paralyzed with fear. Shops closed early. No one walked alone after dark. The rain seemed to grow bolder, its movements more pronounced. It would collect in pools on doorsteps, spiral in impossible patterns on rooftops, and gather in the shadows of alleyways. Sometimes, if you were unlucky, you'd see a silhouette within it, a shape that was almost human, but not quite. The mayor called a meeting in the town hall, desperate for a solution. It was a grim gathering, the air thick with unease. Suggestions ranged from the practical to the absurd, sealing windows with tarps, avoiding the rain altogether, or even performing some kind of ritual to appease whatever force was behind it. "We need to leave. Pack up and go inland. Leave this cursed place behind," Sarah Whitlock said, her voice trembling. She hadn't been the same since James vanished. "And abandon our houses?" someone shouted. Our homes, our livelihoods? The argument raged on until Jacob Renshaw stood and slammed his hand against the table. Enough, he growled. Running won't save you. There is no running away. A heavy silence fell over the room. Some might have wanted to doubt Jacob's words, but the fear and conviction with which he spoke stunned everyone. It was during the next storm that the truth of Jacob's words became clear. The rain began as a steady drizzle and grew heavier as night fell. Most of the townsfolk stayed indoors, watching from behind locked doors and shuttered windows, but a few brave souls ventured out, determined to prove they weren't afraid. One of them was Tom Mercer. He'd been drinking, his courage bolstered by whiskey. He staggered down the cobblestone street, but then he stopped. The rain wasn't just falling. It was pooling around him, forming shapes that slithered and writhed. Tom stumbled backwards, his bravado crumbling. He turned to run, but the rain was faster. It surged forward, enveloping him in a wave of icy droplets. His screams echoed through the empty streets and then cut off abruptly. When the townsfolk found his boots the next morning, they were filled with water, and the sand and stones nearby bore the same strange patterns that had appeared at James's disappearance. By now the town was in full panic. The rain seemed to linger longer, and the patterns it left behind grew more intricate. People began to notice that the shapes weren't random. They resembled maps, or perhaps messages, though no one could decipher them. It was Clara who first suggested a plan. She had been studying the patterns obsessively, sketching them in her notebook. "They're trying to communicate. I am sure of it," she said. "I don't know what they want, but maybe if we figure it out, we can stop this." Few were willing to help her, but Jacob agreed. Together they pored over the patterns, tracing connections and searching for meaning. Days turned into nights as they worked, the rain tapping insistently at the windows as if mocking their efforts. Finally, Clara noticed two things. One of the patterns wasn't just a random shape. It outlined the coastline of Harrow's Cove. At the centre was a spiral that matched the location of the lighthouse. The other thing she noticed was that many of the shapes came in groups of 4. She shared her thoughts with Jacob. "Clearly the lighthouse is important," Jacob murmured, and then he paused, lost in thought. "And what about the number 4? As he spoke these words, Jacob seemed to realize something, and an unnerving expression crept across Jacob's face. The storm the next night was the worst Harrow's Cove had ever seen. The rain fell in torrents, the wind howling like a living thing. But Clara and Jacob stood firm at the edge of the cliffs. Jacob had told Clara nothing of his plan, and she was confused as to exactly why they had come to the cliff top in the middle of a storm. "What do we do?" Clara shouted over the roar of the storm. Jacob held out a hand, his face grim. "We give them what they want. James, Esther, Tom have all been taken. I think that 4 people are wanted. And if that really is the case, then I will be the 4th, and then all this can end." Before Clara could stop him, he stepped into the rain. It moved towards him instantly, wrapping around him like a shroud. For a moment his eyes met Clara's, and he smiled faintly. Then he was gone, his figure dissolving into the downpour. And then the rain abruptly stopped, the storm dissipating as if it had never even been there. The sky cleared, revealing a pale, trembling moon, and Clara stood alone on the cliffs. And in the silent calm, after the storm, she felt very, very alone. The rainwalkers, or whatever they were, never returned to Harrow's Cove, and neither did Jacob. As the years went on, the story grew, and there were all sorts of theories about what had really happened in the cove and to Jacob. Had he really been right? Had Jacob's selfless act appeased the rainwalkers, if they were even real? Clara stayed in the cove, and she took over tending the lighthouse in Jacob's stead. And very occasionally, although she never told anyone this, Clara could hear Jacob's voice whispering softly in the rain.